First of all, thank you, Dr. Shishlicki, and thank you to the Institute for this opportunity. I read in Juan Tamayo's article this morning, I also heard last night, that the Cuban government is saying that it needs $2,500 million in new investment every year to generate moderate economic growth. The question really is, where is that money going to come from? $2,500 million a year. And I think that if you write that number, $2,500 million a year, you have the answer to the energized efforts by the Cuban government, the Cuban lobby, to try to convince the president to lift whatever sanctions remain, because the Cuban government sees that as a way of getting access to the World Bank and the Inter-American Development Bank and the other sources of loans that will not go to really help the Cuban people, if the past is any indication, but to be used for the purposes that the regime has used them in the past. Propaganda, for their self-use, and so on and so forth. I had the opportunity of talking more than 20 years ago with a couple of Cuban economists that were passing Washington, and I heard some of these discussions then. And when I talked to these folks at a banquet, I was very surprised. I said to myself, well, there are people in the Cuban system that are thinking about how to deal with the problems, and they have some solutions, or at least some solutions that could be approached, that could be tried. And I was very optimistic about it at the dinner, until toward the end of the dinner, I walked out with one of them who had to walk outside to smoke a cigar. And then I said, well, this is wonderful. When are they going to start doing some of this? And he said, oh, no, you misunderstood. These are some of our ideas. Now, don't assume that any of that is going to be implemented at any time. So I think we need to take into account that, yes, there are folks in Cuba that have some ideas, and that, yes, we don't know what's going to happen on the island, and if there's ever a new government where those ideas could be implemented, where the human capital of the country could be used, then all kind of models and stuff could be taken care of by themselves. One cannot talk about the Cuban economy, of course, without talking about labor, and we heard a little bit about that. Again, if there is a situation in Cuba where Cuban workers, one of the problems that everybody points out all the time is the low productivity of the Cuban worker. It's nothing new. In Poland, in the Czech Republic, in the Soviet Union, they used to say they pretend that they pay us and we pretend that we work. And the same thing applies to Cuba. Now, how can in a future a government or an economic minister encourage the Cuban workers to work? Well, you have to pay them. The other thing that might be helpful would be to allow a measure of civility in labor relations, meaning independent labor unions, the right to strike. When the workers have something that they want to protect, they work for it. Until that happens, the results are going to be minimal. In the whole discussion about self-employment, I keep thinking about something that I'm not sure everybody understands. What the Cuban government is talking about is bringing back the economic situation as far as economic activity in Cuba to 1968, not to 1959, not to 1958, but to 1968. All of you, many of you will remember that the Cuban leader, Fidel Castro, in 1960, or by the end of 60 or early 61, all major economic activity in Cuba have been confiscated. The banks, the factories, medium-sized businesses. Not only Cubans had the right to grow tomatoes, but they had people who took those tomatoes and put them in cans and sold them as tomato juice or ketchup or whatever. The same thing applies across the economic spectrum. In '68, Fidel Castro, a major speech that Cuban experts know about, began the revolutionary offensive. And what was the revolutionary offensive? Fidel went out and said that Cubans were exploiting other Cubans. And these, of course, were not the owners of Cervecería Tropical or the banks or some factories, people who manufacture various things. All of that having already taken care of in 60 or 61, years earlier. The Cubans that were exploiting other Cubans, according to Fidel, were the barbers, the people who had dry cleaners, the folks who had a little shop at home and they make dresses, that kind of stuff. People who made paper flowers, or who had a stand and they sold fruit, or they sold tamales, that kind of thing. So Raul Castro's idea of how to resolve the Cuban economic nightmare is to bring Cuba back to the nightmare of 1968. So to allow people to make tamales at home and go around and sell them in the neighborhood. I think the other panelists indicate that the likelihood of that kind of economic activity at that level to impact on the real economic nature, the real economic problems of the island is simply a joke. So one has to ask, why is it that the Cuban government talks too much about it? And why is it that the apologists of the Cuban government among people outside Cuba, including some Cuban Americans, talk so much about it? And the answer, from my point of view, is that the talk about the cuentapropistas is simply a way of trying to convince, again, the administration that, and the outside world, that significant economic reforms are taking place in Cuba and that things are getting better. Of course, that's the message to the outside world. The message to the inside world, to Cuba itself, as the folks who read Espacio Laical can tell you, is that Cubans have to be patient. We cannot be like Martin Luther King and Nelson Mandela and the folks who want to get rid of Pinochet. No. We got to be patient. It takes time to do all these things. Now, as has been said here, the new investment law violates all kind of labor rights. But there's another part of that, and that explains, at least in part, why the tremendous decrease in the number of investors, which, again, we all need to be reminded that these are not investors in the sense that one associates with a word. If you're an American investor and you go to Costa Rica, you set up a shop or a factory, and you do business with a partner, probably a Costa Rican banker or somebody else that has that kind of business. None of that happens in Cuba. In Cuba, what you do is what I think Carlos Alberto Montaner has written at some point, is a kind of Trujillo kind of arrangement. Anybody who had businesses in the Dominican Republic really had to do business with Trujillo. Anyone who goes to Cuba to do business does business with the Castro dynasty, with the Castro family. These are the folks who control 51% or at least half of the enterprise. Now, if the government of Cuba wanted really to base the looking for the $2,500 million they need a year, they would encourage certain kinds of activities, economic activities within Cuba. But the problem with that is by doing that, they would be liberating the economic know-how of the Cuban people, but also their political aspirations. So that's what's holding it. There's a connection here between economic and politics that needs to be looked at from time to time. For example, there's no when a Costa Rican or someone in Chile is involved in the economy, that person can export and import, can sell abroad, can bring stuff in. None of that is available in Cuba. Raul Castro is not talking about Cuba in 1960, where Cubans could import and export. The sugar industry is an example of that. The motor, the engine of development of Cuba for over 200 years is no longer there. As far as labor and economics, the sugar industry has been destroyed. What happened to the workers? The government said that they would be retrained. That's the last time I heard about it. I don't know what the retraining is, allowing them to grow some tomatoes or something if they're in the countryside. That's basically what it is. Last night, I thought that there were only certain constraints for talking about food in Cuba. We all heard that the Cubans cannot slaughter their own animals. They go to prison. If you have a cow, you kill. You got to have a permit and all that. But it appears there's more than that. I was talking to someone from the Sierra de Cubitas, also a town called Minas in Camagüey, and they told me that I said, well, what do they grow? And said, well, we had a lot of oranges, and those were being taken care of by the high school kids that used to work on the fields. But since it was very difficult for the regime after a while to continue to feed the students, they're all gone. So now the government in that area has given the land with the orange groves to private people to grow. But the problem is that it's not for them to grow and sell. They have the right to grow and to sell to the government. They cannot just take those oranges and sell them. And some people have gone to prison for trying to do that. And so that even in something like oranges, the government is an obstacle to what would be a very, if you were doing that in the Dominican Republic, you have your oranges, you start selling orange juice, you start doing orange marmalade, you start exporting it. None of that is available in Cuba. Again, the Raul Castro model is 1968. Let the Cubans be barbers, sell peanuts, and that kind of thing. That is not going to help the Cuban economy. What he wants to do is to use the discussion about the increase in the number of supposedly investors and self-employment to try to get around and convince the United States and others that significant changes are taking place And this is the time to lift the sanctions so that they could have access to international finances, basically to keep the regime afloat. Thank you.